All right, perfect. Looks like we have some folks who are still joining, so we'll give it just a few more seconds, then we'll kick off into today's content. So appreciate everyone who has joined us, and we'll get started here in just a second. All right, looks like we've hit the critical number here, so let's go ahead and get kicked off. So today's webinar is going to focus around setting KPIs and OKRs in your threat modeling program. So by no means is today going to be an exhaustive boot camp on KPIs and OKR management, but hopefully we'll provide some good guidance that'll be helpful for you guys. So today's agenda. So we're going to give kind of a brief overview of what are OKRs. We're going to talk a little bit about setting objectives within threat modeling and kind of articulating like what's the value that I'm trying to achieve. We'll recommend a few sample key results and sample objectives based on a few predetermined scenarios, and then we'll go over some sample key performance indicators within threat modeling. So first off, let's talk about what constitutes value, right? Because ultimately, as we talk about threat modeling, we want to be driving to that value. So what is the value of a threat model, right? So value is return minus cost. So when we think about value within threat modeling, it's creating a threat model isn't just the value proposition we're looking for, right? Obviously, I can create a threat model, I can create some representation of my system, but it's not until I start achieving the concept of do I have threats, do I have relevant countermeasures, and then ultimately have those countermeasures been implemented, resulting in a reduced risk for the organization, for the system being modeled, right? So if we kind of think about this trend of moving from threat model to implemented control, it's going to start informing on maybe how we do threat modeling or how we want to set our objectives with respect to the behaviors we want to encourage, the behaviors we want to see over time. So moving into our next area, the concept of diminished marginal returns also helps us understand what kind of objective are we seeking inside of our threat modeling efforts. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this concept, right? So think about the concept of maybe cleaning your home or cleaning your vehicle, right? That first hour to 2 hours you spend doing that big cleanup, you get a ton of results, right? That the house looks immediately better. You can start to see the shine on that car, but then you spend another hour and another hour on that particular activity, and the return doesn't quite seem as good. Maybe you've cleaned in an area you haven't seen before, you've done that additional effort, but we still don't have quite the same return that we had initially at the beginning. And when we apply this concept to threat modeling, you'll see that we have the exact same law being represented in our outputs, right? Because when I toss that first threat model up on the screen, and maybe I'm just looking at a net security change, I'm making this configuration change to an API. Well, immediately I'm going to see that we're going to start seeing these real, hey, I've got this new change, I've got all these new threats and all these new countermeasures that need to be implemented. Immediately I start seeing value on that. But as the time spent on that threat model increases and I start getting to where it's, I've got full system representation, maybe I've even got the underlying infrastructure, the entire environment, all of that being threat modeled and taken into consideration for every single threat model, I'm going to start seeing that diminishing returns, because realistically, I've probably described that environment somewhere else, and continuing to describe and enumerate on this particular threat model isn't going to add that additional value that I'm hoping for versus the amount of time it takes to get to that level of accuracy. So, and the way we kind of, diminish that, and we work on, getting back to that net security change is by intentionally limiting the scope on our threat models. And this is just kind of an example of, how do we design OKRs and objectives so that we start seeing that increased marginal return as opposed to that diminished return that you see over time by spending too long in different parts of our threat modeling process, right? Because as we get to that threat model that is just really, really accurate, we're going to find that, the time investment to generate that 727th countermeasure may not be worth it because the cost to implement that security control is higher than the cost of exploit, right? So kind of keep this in mind as we talk through some of the OKRs and some of the challenges we're going to see here, as we move into kind of the next slide. So obviously, it's helpful to understand what are OKRs. So in this next section, we'll kind of talk about OKRs from a high level. Obviously, there's some great books out there and there are great courses around how to set OKRs, how to follow through with them. But for today, we're going to leave it as surface as high level as we possibly can. An objective is simply what is to be accomplished. Should be crisp, one-line statement that's meaningful, action-oriented, and ideally inspirational, right? It represents a change or a destination where we want to be with respect to our threat modeling practice. A key result should be specific, time-bound, and the structure should be measurable and able to be assigned a grade at the end of the OKR cycle, right? So a lot of people, and I've met some people who, ultimately they do not like OKRs as an instrument for setting strategic direction and measuring progress, right? All an OKR is just saying that, hey, I've got some desirable future state that I want to move towards. It is creating measurable criteria against that particular state, and then it's creating a tactical plan to accomplish that. Whether or not you're doing that through, MBOs, OKRs, KPIs, or any other three-letter acronym we have towards, what is really just good management and good project planning in a focused area, that's perfectly fine. OKRs are just a framework to get there. So if you're not a fan of OKRs, that's perfectly fine. Today's session is going to focus around, again, still setting objectives, and then how do we measure against those objectives? And then what milestones or markers should we see along the way to start seeing progress against those items? So, and then lastly, key results can be rejected or rewritten as new information becomes available, right? It's okay to reject objectives, key results over time. As new information becomes available, perfectly fine to abandon the plan as long as you have a good reason why. And hopefully an improved objective or an improved key result is going to come out as a result of that particular item. So it really just depends on, how the organization changes, how the environment changes, and the ability to pivot quickly and find something that is in reality more value. So for example, if you saw that, law of diminishing returns there at the beginning, and you thought, holy smokes, we're spending 50 hours creating this accurate representation of a threat model. That's great, but the cost to do that is extremely high. So if you're looking for ways to enhance my return on threat models, you could start using, and we'll talk about this in a second, so concepts like time blocking. And it's okay to reject a current objective in favor of a new one over time if we can demonstrate that we have an increased value there. So let's go ahead and go into our scenarios and start talking through different types of objectives and different types of countermeasures, or different types of key results. So first scenario, organization needs to improve the overall efficiency and effectiveness of its threat modeling program, right? So something we can probably all agree with. So first off, what does this organization have? So number one, they have a threat modeling program. Okay, and that's important to state because this is an organization that we're going to make the assumption has an efficient process. They've got a policy in place. They're actively threat modeling. They've educated people. So we're making those assumptions about this scenario, right? Because remember, the objectives that you set for your program are going to depend on where your program is today. So for example, I know this may surprise some of you watching this, I am not a professional athlete. So for me to say that I'm planning on playing in the Super Bowl next year seems quite far-fetched because there's no way I'm going to attain to that level of athletic accomplishment being an amateur, right? Same thing when it comes to setting OKRs in your threat modeling program. And I know we've got another session coming up where we're going to unpack this more at Snowfrog coming up later this month or later next month. But looking at where you are in your program and finding objectives that will move you from a low process maturity to a high process maturity or a low business integration to a high business integration environment is very important, because if not, it's easy to create very aspirational OKRs that represent a state that really isn't attainable, right? So threat modeling and creating OKRs where you are to the desired state, where you want to be. So in our objective, we want to grow threat modeling value per threat model. Okay, it's kind of our sample objective, and I think one we can all agree with, right? Key result number one, to achieve a 4-hour threat model across all version 1 projects by implementing time blocking processes by end of Q2. So when we talk about time blocking, what is that? If you're familiar with the concept of, work has a tendency to fill the time allotted to it. If I only allow 4 hours for a threat model, that threat model will only consume 4 hours. And then you combine that with the concept of law of diminishing returns. And, at the end of that 4 hours, I've got version 1. Okay. And version 1 must include, a description of what the net security change is, a basic description of that infrastructure. But by creating that time block and then forcing, maybe my scoping activity, my threats activities and countermeasures into that 4, 5, 6 hour segment, now we've contained what V1 needs to look like of that threat model, so that as we come back around for V2, and this is where we get to key result number 2, all V2 projects are completed within an additional 2 hours by the end of Q3. We've set very specific time requirements and what our expectations are for that threat model. Now, a couple underlying assumptions here. We've already talked about this organization has a strong process maturity, at least that's based on the scenario. So my assumption is that someone has defined for the team, what does done look like? What does good look like as it pertains to these particular threat models, right? Because we don't want to just get through 4 hours and say, okay, 4 hours, we're done, bam. And there's been no control assessment, right? So within that 4 hours, now we would look down and say, okay, we're going to spend 90 minutes doing scoping and assessment of what that change is. And then after that, we go into threats assessment. What can go wrong? And then lastly, my control review. What can I do about it? And then ultimately implementation by those downstream teams, right? So moving from I have a process to how can I improve that process and make it more efficient using something like time blocking. In our next scenario, we have a diverse group of threat modeling practitioners operating independently with wide variances in process, tooling, and output, right? So now we have an organization that is, again, still very mature, but maybe we have more of a decentralized process here. And then each one of those teams are maybe using different tools, right? So maybe one team's using Visio, one team's using Microsoft Threat Modeling. There's always one tool out there, the spreadsheet and the PowerPoint design tool, right, that they're using. So how do we move from there, and then what OKRs could we set? So, for example, we have enhanced threat modeling process efficiency, so achieving a 30% reduction in the time required for threat modeling activities across all projects by implementing a standardized automation tool and process by the end of Q2, right? So again, focusing here on, we've got our objective, we're focusing on efficiency. Our first key result is 30% reduction. So we have something that is very measurable in the time required for threat modeling activities. Now, the underlying assumption here, though, is that we're actually measuring some of this to begin with, right? And maybe there's even a precursor here or a key input that is required. If you're not measuring your threat modeling today in terms of inputs and outputs, you're going to have a very difficult time determining success here. So if your organization isn't measuring how long it's taking to generate a threat model or how long it's taking to, go through different phases of that threat model, I would consider that as probably a prerequisite to even getting to this level. Because how do I determine if I have a reduction in time if I don't know how long it takes me today? Now, the good thing about that is you can start measuring today, and then by the end of the quarter, you're able to actually have a good baseline with a large enough sample size and be able to determine, have I have a 30% reduction maybe in quarter, Q3 or something. Key result number 2, increase the number of threat models completed per quarter by 20% through streamlined workflows and automation. Now, obviously, in this example, this particular customer has decentralized threat modeling. So this would be getting all teams onto that centralized process, centralized workflow, and then providing some underlying automation to help sustain the centralized process that they've created. Key result number 3, conduct a training program for development and security teams, resulting in 50% trained in threat modeling best practices by end of the year. With any organization that has a good amount of decentralized threat modeling, you're going to find that the outputs vary greatly from team to team, both in terms of, what is the quality of that threat model, both in accuracy, depending on who's in the room, what that system representation looks like, as well as just the quality of threats and countermeasures that come out of it. I am not an expert at all things. And if you ask me to provide an opinion on the threats for different types of architecture, I'm going to give you a very varied response based on my experience, based on my knowledge level, right? It's hard to be an expert on all things. And so with a decentralized model, you're going to find that you're going to get those different outputs. And by creating a process in a centralized tool, you can ensure that you have a consistent quality, that process is sustained by the tool, and that way you're not having to, rigidly enforce that particular item, manually all the time. You let the tool do that for you. It looks like we do have a question come in, so we pause for a second. So who typically owns threat modeling in an organization? Security, architecture, someone else? What does the RACI matrix looks like for success? Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it has to live at a higher level than that. Obviously, I think that threat modeling needs to be a top-down initiative. So I would say it's something that definitely the CISO should be involved in enforcing and involved in that process. Let me just open that question back up. As far as, what does the RACI matrix look like? I think that that's going to vary from organization to organization. And it's also going to depend on where the threat modeling is actually occurring in the organization. So early stage versus late stage. And I think that who is going to be responsible for those activities and when they occur are going to change based on, where you're going to live in that threat modeling ecosystem. So if you're a pre-design, threat modeling organization, I think a lot of that is going to live, and you want that to live as close to the developers as you possibly can. Just because they're talking about the change there, and before we want them making changes, we want them talking about security. If a system's already in place, you may find that security is ultimately owning more of that, but I think it varies on where you're going to be in the ecosystem. Next one here. So the next scenario. So organization has a mature and business integrated threat modeling process that is further sustained by a threat modeling product. So in this example, they've got a product, and that could be an IriusRisk, that could be a Microsoft threat modeling tool, right? They've got some product that's being consistently used. It's a mature process, and it is business integrated. Okay. So for this one, we have strength and collaboration between development and security teams. So kind of like the question that we just had here. Key result number one would be to facilitate cross-functional workshops between development and security teams, resulting in a 40% increase in collaborative threat modeling sessions by end of May. Right. Again, tying together, can I measure it? Do I have a timeline? Is this attainable? Right. Think about all of the SMART goals we normally assist with strategic planning. And then how do we bring those things together? So cross-functional team, meaning we have representation from our security champions, meaning we have representation from security, we have architecture in there. Key result number two, implementing a feedback mechanism to address identified threats, aiming for a 50% reduction in the time taken to remediate critical issues by end of the year, right? Couple items here to unpack, right? So number one, a feedback mechanism. That implies, again, that you're measuring some underlying process. So how long does it take to go from, and again, we have to break this up into, pre-production threat model versus post-production threat model. So let's assume this system is in production, I'm threat modeling a change, or I'm threat modeling something here. How long does it take for that critical item to be implemented successfully, right? Ultimately, we want a threat model as far left as we possibly can, but that is not always possible. So how long does it take before a critical countermeasure is implemented in that production system or in a pre-production system, right? So again, it goes back to, are we measuring these things sometimes before we can focus on improving them? And then third, establish a regular communication channel between security and development teams, leading to a 30% improvement in information sharing related to emerging threats and vulnerabilities, right? So, and this, again, comes back down to that collaboration piece. So as teams start working together, and obviously you have a security team over here that's responsible for, orchestrating and highlighting security issues. And then we have maybe a development team over here that is responsible for the implementation of those items over time. I have one team creating work for another team, and then I have another team that has to implement all of that work. It's very easy to see how the collaboration and the partnership of those teams can sometimes be at odds, because as I continue working and continue creating more and more content for those teams and more security concerns and items they have to implement, it starts to feel like a bit of a dumping ground for problems, right? Because now development has to go and implement all of those things. So getting our security champions and getting our development teams invested into the security process and understanding, what is the true return on investment for threat modeling, which is to reduce the time to fix and the amount of effort required to implement all those things without having to go through all of the concrete costs generally associated with, okay, I've already got a system in production and we didn't threat model it, or we didn't identify severe and critical risks. And now we have to go back and rip and replace, rebuild, add new features, remove features, all of the the downtime associated with all of that. We have to go back through that entire process, right? So getting them on the same page with respect to, what is the value of threat modeling, getting them communicating across that channel, and further strengthening that collaboration within those two teams. Our next scenario, we have an organization that is new to formal threat modeling and does not have a well-defined process. So couple highlights here. Obviously, I say formal threat modeling. Everyone does threat modeling to some extent. Sometimes it's ad hoc. Sometimes it's not even called threat modeling. It's, it's a risk assessment, which is threat modeling is risk assessment, right? But in this organization, we've got, kind of an ad hoc process. It's not super great, but it's, it's moving forward, and we don't have a formal program. Okay. So sample OKR, standardized threat modeling practice, right? So establish a standardized threat modeling framework and documentation for all development teams, resulting in a 95% adherence to best practice. Now, 95% is a lofty goal for a first-time process, right? But we have a standardized process. Okay, for it to be standardized, that means it needs to be documented. It needs to be available to all parties. They need to provide education to those users, process training. So similar today, how we've had, different scenarios and different labs, right? So making sure that they have a way to access that information and they know how to action it. Conducting regular reviews to ensure consistency in threat modeling outputs with the goal of reducing variations by 80% across different projects, right? So ensuring here that regardless of what the output is, we've got active documented expectations of what does a threat model output look like. And then anytime we do have a variation from that, we need to understand what caused that variation. Because recognize that, creating a version 1 of a process might mean that we don't have the solution documented yet, or it's not documented well enough. So if we start seeing variation across our threat modeling process, we might find that we've got a documentation problem, right? And this should be an ongoing conversation. Hey guys, what's not working about threat modeling? And you may find that, well, we got to jump through a lot of hoops and we've got to generate all this documentation. By the way, most of which doesn't add value to the threat modeling process. If you remember, we had that value funnel, what you didn't see on there was potentially, stakeholder reporting, which doesn't get reviewed. So making sure that the things we ask of our teams actually add value to the threat modeling process. And absolutely, is there a place and time for reporting? Absolutely. But someone should actively be reviewing that reporting if we're asking someone to generate it. And then B, someone should actually be doing something with the information we ask them to read. So if the answer is we have a metric and we're looking in at that process, we want to know, is someone actively doing something with that information? And if the answer is not, then we probably should eliminate that task and eliminate that requirement. Just because obviously it takes a lot of time for everyone to generate those reports and work in those sections. So, the least waste we can have in that process, the faster it can flow. And again, the more value we can add to that threat modeling process. So, and then key result number 3, develop and implement a metrics dashboard by end of month to track and report on threat modeling programs, ensuring visibility and accountability at all levels. And again, at all levels is important. I'm a big fan of very visible dashboards, just because if teams are able to see that they are actively below a particular benchmark. So for example, if we implemented the 4-hour threat model, if teams know they're over the 4-hour threat model consistently, we understand that as a team, we are not doing what we are supposed to do. Okay. And that's the nice thing about nice big visual dashboards teams can see, teams can report on, is especially if we start having teams, I don't want to say compete, this is not, but we have teams compete against, creation and execution of process. I think we'll start to see, again, more efficiencies there. So any other questions before we move out of the OKRs and start moving into some sample KPIs within a particular threat modeling organization? Let me just scroll through. There were a couple questions that looks like they might have been answered, but all right. Well, let's go ahead and jump into the KPI section then. So why KPIs, right? Why KPIs versus, OKRs? OKRs help me set a really good direction into where I'm going and let me have very measurable criteria along the way. KPIs, however, can provide valuable point-in-time data into pending success or failure of a progress. So, for example, if I were to think about the idea of the 4-hour time block, again, 4 hours for my threat model, but at the moment, I know that threat model is at exactly 2.5 hours, and it's in a tier 3 workflow status. That tells me, do I have a problem in this threat model? As opposed to, is this being implemented successfully or being threat modeled successfully over time? So let's look at some sample process KPIs. So number one, adherence to standardized practices, right? So process incidents. How many times have I seen process failure occur? Where do those process failures occur at? And again, the point here is that over time, I can start to see that, okay, well, it seems like we're really struggling with accurately describing system architecture in an efficient amount of time. Okay, and does that mean, number one, do I have the wrong people in the room for the threat model? Okay, number two, do we just struggle at it? Do we have a training problem? Right, and that's entirely possible. But until we start looking at some of these data points, we really don't know. Now, there are a lot of good managers and good leaders who operate on a good gut feeling. But if I have to justify budget based on gut, sometimes that's a little harder to defend as opposed to having, good data here around our standardized practices. Percentage of projects with integrated automation. Something we will talk about, I think, future on these webinar series is quantifying, return on an investment or return on security investment, right? So if I'm thinking about, I've bought a tool, that tool has the ability to automatically create tickets with my issue tracker, but I'm still creating them manually. Obviously there's one behavior here is going to have a considerably higher return on investment versus the other. And then how do I encourage that behavior one versus the other? Obviously I'm a big fan of making the right way the easy way. And that's where having a product or tool that fits your business process, or you built a business process to fit a tool. Sometimes that happens depending on, how much radical change you need to see. But this is something that should be tracked, right? How many times are we manually creating a ticket versus automation is creating that ticket and creating that downstream workflow? Feedback loop effectiveness. So how many times do I have a secure by default standard being deployed in my threat modeling process, right? Because if I've gone through and I've said, hey, this particular configuration, man, we're seeing a lot of it, and I'm making this recommendation all the time. Okay, why isn't that being done by default? Why am I having to make that recommendation every single time we go through a security review? What's different about the person that's either architecting this solution or the business requirements that are driving this? And why hasn't that been incorporated into our new default standards? Okay. That's something that I think a lot of organizations struggle with because we're so into getting the work done that we don't think about, hey, if we change these two things, we can save ourselves 20% of our time in the future. And this is part of where the automation piece comes in, because I can actually monitor for, hey, I've got this manual threat that's consistently been added in all my threat models. I can take that manual threat and I can now automate its application into those threat models so that over time, I'm not seeing any manual threats. I'm letting the application or the product start to apply all of those different items to my threat model for me. And that should be something that at the conclusion of your threat model inside of IriusRisk, you can actually go in and look at that source column and see, okay, hey, I got 34 threats here, maybe 10% of my total threat count that were manually added by my team. Why were these added versus the default content? I want to know that as an organization. Obviously, we want to know that as well. But those threats can then be taken and lifted up into the library. And then the next time you threat model that particular component, those items are just automatically included. They've already got the security recommendation, the security control and best practice on there for all of the users involved. Okay. And again, these are just more process KPIs. I do break them down into different segments here. So financial KPIs. So threat model review cycle time. How long does it take to complete a threat model? So time per required CM, countermeasure, and time per implemented countermeasure, right? Because again, the longer our team is spending on a given threat model, the higher the cost of that threat model, and over time, the decreased marginal return of each additional hour spent on that particular threat model. What was the number of threats discovered in that post-release cycle? What was the remediation time for those critical threats? What is the cost of my security incident over time? And you can see there's potential here for tracking these items in a trend and in a, I can see which one of these are going up and which ones are going down. I should see a decrease in the remediation time for critical threats over time. Because in an ideal world where we are a shift left focused organization, we should start seeing the implementation of more and more best practices and the reduction of design flaws and the reduction of security issues prior to that system making it into production. At least, again, that's the goal, right? So we'd want to be able to track these over time and see that we're trending in a positive direction. And then the next item, and this is going to be our last slide for the day, is going to be our sample value KPIs. So number of threat models created. And again, we want to see how many of those are threat models of production systems, how many of them are pre-production systems or maybe design phase systems, how many of those are a net security change, how many of those are just a net configuration change. And again, this goes back to requires a description of done. At what point in my threat model have I communicated to teams that, you know what, we're done with this version of a threat model? It's time to move on to a new system that doesn't have a threat model, hasn't been threat modeled at all, because it's very easy to work, 10, 20, 50, 80 hours on a threat model. And then I've got 70 other systems here that haven't been threat modeled at all. Quantity of high priority, prioritized actionable threats. So breaking this down, high priority and prioritized and actionable, right? So thinking about each one of those components. So obviously this means that now I've got a way to determine which of my threats is what's the priority of it. And then I've got them enumerated and how I'm going to address them. And I've got a plan to actually address and reduce those particular items over time, right? Quantity of high value prioritized actionable countermeasures, percentage of high risk threats that are mitigated. So again, applying the same strategy now, but looking at countermeasures, because it's not just about generating how many countermeasures can I see. Because I mean, obviously, like with any automation tool, I can generate noise as long as the day is, but the value is how many of them are high value. How many of them can I actually do something about? Have they been prioritized? Do I have a plan to implement them? Have they been overlaid on a timeline? Do I know what my release and what my scheduled remediation is on those items over a subset time period, whether that's 2 weeks or 90 days? And then ultimately a percentage of high risk threats mitigated, right? And that kind of takes us back to that value pipeline. I'm going from threat model or system all the way to the reduction of risk, right? And we have to make sure we continue to be value aligned, because it's really easy to say, well, guys, we did 80 threat models this year. Nobody cares, right? Ultimately, it's not about the quantity of threat models. It's about that reduction in risk. And I think we have to start talking about that delta between those 2 points and start encouraging behaviors through OKRs and then measurement as well with KPIs on those particular items over time. So, and I think that's our last area. So maybe I'll move on and we'll start talking through, do we have any questions from this particular item? It looks like I see some comments here. Okay, so I'll pause here for a second and say any questions or any other comments. Feel free to toss them in the chat. or feel free to add them in the question and answer section here, and we will address them as they come up. Okay. All right. Looks like we're not seeing any other questions, at least here at the top. So with that, I think we might go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Definitely. Oh, we have 2 more questions. I'm sorry. So what is the key criteria to limit a threat model to 4 hours? Struggling to understand the time limit threat model a bit. Okay. So first thing I would think about here is, and again, going back to the concept of diminishing returns. The more time I spend on a threat model, at some point, that additional hour doesn't yield the value that it costs to spend that additional hour. Okay. Now, when does that occur? It depends, right? It depends on what the threat model is. It depends on what that content is. But if I were to put out a definition that said, okay, in the next 4 hours, we're going to have a basic representation of a very tightly scoped threat model. So in version 1, we're only going to focus on this particular integration that is changing. So I'm adding a new API to this particular system. This API is going to talk with a backend database. It's going to serve this tight function. So for V1, I'm only going to look at that particular information. And then I'm, maybe in version 2, which is, in the next set of time block, I'm going to focus on working out from that API, maybe moving over to the user interface that person's also going to interact with. But the whole concept of time blocking is I'm grabbing a very specific piece for this particular iteration. I'm deliberately limiting my scope to that which is immediately actionable. And then I'm saying I'm going to create my diagram and system representation within 1 to 2 hours. I'm then going to do an assessment of threats in 60 minutes. I'm then going to do an assessment of controls in 60 minutes. And then that now becomes version 1 of my threat model. And version 1 is very important because that implies that we are then going to iterate and come back and review that again sometime in the future. So, I think the struggle a lot of people see is they'll say, well, we threat modeled it once, it's done. But the application changes. Obviously, we still have configuration drift. We also have threat landscape change. The threat actors are changing, the technology is changing. We have new vulnerabilities being introduced all the time. Matter of fact, that's just great job security for developers, right? But over time, you're going to have to continue, threat modeling back through that item. And that's kind of where the time blocking comes in, right? It prevents you from spending an excess of time on a given activity. And then another question here, is there an example risk reduction KPI associated with the threat modeling process? An example risk reduction KPI associated with threat modeling process. So for that, I would think about example risk reduction process. I think risk reduction would be difficult to measure as a KPI, just because how do I measure I guess measuring the change in risk would be difficult, unless I were measuring it in, some kind of implemented countermeasure status over time. I think that could be used to kind of demonstrate, total reduction in risk. The part that I think would be difficult would be measuring, what is my starting point based on some kind of quantitative measure. But that's a great question. Yeah. So automation is great, but how do you handle the things you can't automate, like business logic exploits? Then how do you measure KPIs for that? So great question. Automation is great, but how do you handle the things you can't automate, like business logic exploits? How do you measure KPIs for that? Yeah, that's a great question. So for business logic exploits and items like that, I mean, I think it still comes down to ultimately what's the defined process. And I think about, if I did have a business logic exploit, what is the intended business process? what does deviation look like? And then, ultimately, how do I measure success? And I think if I have well-defined objectives and criteria at each of those points, I'm able to still measure the delta across, all three over time. And again, that's certainly not an easy one. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you off the top of my head from a precise KPI, but that's a good question. And just scrolling down here, I think that kind of gets us through most of the questions. Oh, it looks like we've got one question left here. What's the biggest challenge in just starting threat modeling where maturity is zero? Yeah, so from that standpoint, I always go back to process. Again, if you don't have a process today, finding the right product can be challenging. And that's just because there are any number of products on the marketplace. Obviously, we're a fan of IriusRisk, right? But at the end of the day, it's still helpful to have even the bare bones process, which could be a 4 questions framework, right? So what are we building? What are we scoping? What's in scope for this given threat model? What can go wrong? What can we do about it, or what are we going to do about it? And then have we done a good job, or a measure of our effectiveness? Okay. Now, if we have an organization whose maturity is just ultimate zero, right? I think that comes down to, we need to define what's going to be our MVP process. We need to set that schedule for 90 days. And then at the end of 90 days, we start implementing any of the observed, changes and problems we saw during that window. But I think it's, much like anything else, you're going to have an MVP. You're going to iterate on that MVP, that minimally viable process over time. And I think that some of the early objectives we had around where, maybe the objective is to create a threat modeling practice, that first key result would be to, define that process, articulate to all teams within 90 days, so much more attainable key results on that front. So, and I think that kind of brings us to where we are at the end. It looks like a couple of people are still getting some links in here. Okay. All right. Well, guys, we appreciate you guys joining us for today's webinar. Hopefully some of the information we provided was valuable. Obviously, a lot of these are just good examples of some predetermined scenarios. But hopefully we're able to take some of these, find some new applications to them, and ultimately achieve some value in your organization as well. So we very much appreciate you guys joining us today. And please let us know if you guys have any feedback on the session, or leave some good questions and comments, and we'll get through and answer those. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.